Terry Moffat is a researcher who's interested in early onset versus late onset conduct disorder. She pointed out that for many teens, acting out can be relatively benign. Most teens act out to some extent. However, there are what she calls snares, behaviors that in and of themselves can cause lasting problems, and they are the usual suspects: risky sexual behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, and hanging out with deviant peers. The investigators in the Minnesota study were interested in investigating the antecedents of this type of risky behavior. When adolescents engage in frequent sexual activity, especially with multiple partners and without adequate use of contraception, as you might expect, they place themselves at risk for health and economic problems. If you have a baby when you're a teen, the chances of dropping out of high school increase, and that in turn decreases the likelihood of your being able to earn a good wage. Early age of first intercourse is another risk factor because it's associated with these other factors and also with early pregnancy. In the Minnesota data, the single status of the mother at the time of the child's birth was the single strongest predictor of attention hyperactivity problems in elementary school. Single status of the mother at birth also predicted drug and alcohol problems and risky sexual activity in the next generation, that is, their own children engaged in these risky behaviors. So risky sexual behavior plays a role in a cycle of disadvantage across generations, from disadvantage to sexual acting out and other problems to disadvantage again. Any thoughts on interventions? Just as was true for competence and earlier behavior problems, risky sexual behavior was also predictable from a variety of psychosocial antecedents. These types of problems don't just simply spring up in adolescence without a history. Lawfulness of emergence was found when they looked at specific variables such as age at first intercourse, number of partners, and when they defined groups of high-risk teens based on combinations of frequent and unprotected sexual activity. Having first intercourse at later ages was significantly predicted by a history of early positive care, peer competence, low behavior problems, and low family life stress in elementary school. The high sexual risk group was predicted by poor support on the grade 1 home scale, negative emotional climate in the family at age 13, poor parental monitoring during adolescence, and lack of motivation in school beginning as early as first grade. Other findings regarding risky sexual behavior were more specifically tied to theory. Gender boundary violation was associated with age of becoming sexually active for the whole subsample and in particular for girls, although the researchers cautioned that the sample size was small. For girls, gender boundary violation was also significantly related to failure to use contraception. And for boys, boundary violation was significantly related to the number of sexual partners. In the case of drug and alcohol use, it's important to distinguish between heavy participation and experimentation. Research suggests that those who experiment with drugs or alcohol typically have more positive backgrounds and are generally more competent and psychologically healthy as teens and later than either those who are heavy drinkers or, interestingly, those who abstain totally from any type of substance use or experimentation. In the Minnesota study, a history of either sexual or physical abuse was associated with heavy use of drugs. Not surprising. The major variables that were examined as antecedents of alcohol use were parental support and hostility measures from the preschool period and age 13. Both parental hostility in the preschool period and hostility at age 13 discriminated heavy drinkers, with teens who experienced a lot of parental hostility drinking more heavily. These measures also correlated with how often the teens became drunk or high on drugs, as did attachment and behavior problems in elementary school. And finally, we move on to associating with deviant youth. Associated with troubled youth or hanging out with the wrong crowd is often given credit for all the problems of young people, especially in more popular writing, and in some ways that's completely understandable. Associating with deviant peers is related to serious problem behavior, such as drug and alcohol abuse, risky sexual behavior, and early pregnancy. These relationships were very strong in the Minnesota data as well. Having friends that were troubled was far and away the best, strongest predictor of criminality in later adolescence. But at the same time, blaming all the problems of youth on deviant friends is too simplistic. It misses the point that having these kinds of friends in the first place is itself a developmental outcome, however important it is for subsequent behavior. You don't just start hanging out with deviant friends all of a sudden. Associating with deviant peers, as measured by a combination of teacher, mother, and child reports, was significantly predicted by the early care summary variable, as well as parental support at grade 1 and parent-child boundary dissolution at age 13. Being victimized by peers at the summer camp correlated 0.39 with associating with deviant youth. So those who later associate with troublemakers have a history of low competence with peers. This sounds like another opportunity for an intervention, doesn't it? In middle childhood, those who were confident in themselves tended to form friendships with other confident and competent children. This meant that others were either left to associate with less competent children or they were isolated. In either case, it would make it more difficult to acquire the skills that you need for later competent social functioning. And we are finally at the end of adolescence.